what is the issue of tank in Overwatch? Is this problem even fixable? Now, I know some of you are going to be saying, oh, but it's a 6v6 issue, and you may be right. It definitely may have exacerbated some of the issues with tank as a whole. But I think for us to really answer the question, we actually have to look outside of Overwatch. Tank as a role in general, whether it's MMOs in a PvP or even a PvE situation, is a really problematic role. People don't want to play it. People don't know how to make it function in a PvP environment where you can't make people shoot you. And when you do, you have to decide if that's actually fun for the tank or fun for the person shooting you. And how do you make this role bigger and more powerful without making it the most important person in the entire battlefield? Or maybe it is the most important person, and maybe it's a complicated discussion. And so we're going to be getting into this philosophy and the psychology of what tanking actually is, not just in the first-person shooter genre, but in Overwatch and the gaming situation as a whole. And I'm going to actually have my Twitch chat pulled up on the video so that you can check that out and find out some of the discussion in the discourse. We're going to be talking a lot in detail about not just the 5v5 and 6v6 format and how we need to nerf tank busters, but overall, is there a way that we can reconcile the psychology of what a tank is supposed to bring to the table without necessarily breaking the game? Is there nuance? Is there an answer to be found at all? All of these questions and more. Let me know what you think in the comments and enjoy the video. So let's start with this. What is a tank? What do you guys think a tank is? What is a tank? What does it mean to tank? Now, some of you guys are like, oh yeah, we're Spilo viewers. We know what a tank is. Like, you create space and you do threat and stuff. But like, seriously, what makes a tank unique compared to because that's the real question, is like, don't tell me what tank does. Tell me what tank does that's unique compared to other characters in the Overwatch cast. Frontline, initiator and spear of the push, suffering to juice out the wazoo and bust. Okay, I should have read that one. Tempo controller, space. We have a higher IQ, initiator, fat health bar. Yeah. But do you see how like this is not a super easy question to answer, especially in Overwatch 2. Back in Overwatch 1, it was you created space, or at least that was our current understanding. But not only as the game has changed, but also as our understanding as the game has changed, we kind of understand that like really every character has a responsibility to create space. In other words, every character needs to be a threat or supporting threats to control and create space. And what does space mean? It means getting, like, let's say I want to take this high ground here. How do I take this high ground when there's a soldier on it? Well, I'm going to jump onto the soldier, force him to back up so that now that my soldier can take the high ground. But also, why am I relying on my tank? What if I'm the soldier? Can I take a flank to contest this guy and maybe win the duel and force him out so that he's not shooting my team, right? What if I'm Kiriko? Well, I have freaking wall climb, right? I should be looking to help heal my team and then shoot the soldier myself, or make him look at me so at least he's not shooting my vulnerable people on main, right? So to me, okay, this is where I think the definition of tank is. Let me get my notes here. This is where I think the definition of tank is. I think the definition of a tank is somebody that creates space for longer and does so generally in closer ranges. So what's the difference between a tracer in a backline and a wrecking ball in a backline? Tank just generally has longer pressure cycles. Well, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, like an Orisa can flank, but an Orisa's gonna live, and she's gonna live, and she's going to live. So what ends up happening is you create space, you create pressure, but you do so for longer cycles. You guys get what I'm saying? And there's one other thing that we talked about, right? How many poke heroes do we have in the tank role? Seriously, think about it. Compared to Widowmaker and Ana and Zenyatta and freaking Symmetra, right? Not you guys are saying one, but really, think about it even from Sigma's perspective. I can't even hit that second robot. Look at that. I can't even reach him. Bro, I can reach this guy easier with a freaking Mercy pistol than I can with Sigma. So you have like Malga who can kind of do some work here, but obviously it's awkward. You have Orisa, which has no fall off, but she has such a massive hitbox, she gets smoked, so it's situationally, right? Ram, kind of, but he's obviously a slower moving projectile. There's no hit scan here. Where am I looking for, right? But really, we don't have a lot of tanks that do very well. And even the tanks that do, Malga, Orisa, and Ram, the irony is these are all brawl tanks. These are more effective in closer ranges. So we really don't have a raw, hard poke tank. The closest thing we ever had to it was Overwatch 1 Orisa because she could shield, then shoot. But even then, she was significantly weaker at range. They're all stronger up close. So why is that the case? Why is that the case? and there's some psychology behind this, all right? I want you guys to ride with me here, all right? It's a really important psychology here. When we talk about psychology, we are attracted either in a negative or a positive. Our attention is taken by proximity, all right? That's one of the reasons why Widowmaker is such a problem, because she's so lethal, but she doesn't get close to you. So she doesn't feel lethal. I mean, it's hardwired in us as human beings outside of the video game. Proximity is threat. Proximity is threat. We look at things that are close, right? So tanks' job is to create space, bait attention, and to do so for long periods of time. And why tanks are so good at it in comparison to DPS is that in general, tanks get close to you. And this is loud. And this has your attention. And the hard part that I sometimes have as a coach is training people to sometimes know when a tank isn't a threat, even when the tank is close. So what ends up happening is tanks exploit the psychology of things that are close are more threatening. And so what ends up happening is, let me give you guys an example. A Winston jumps your backline and a Tracer's on the flank. What is easier to look at? The Winston that jumps you as a support, or the Tracer that's also shooting you in the back at the same time? It's way easier. And even unless you specifically trained yourself to mark Tracer, right? You're looking at Winston. Yeah, no, you're giving me the smart answer, but people are gonna look at Winston, right? Why? Because he's close. He's up in your face. He's loud. He's big. And so that's how tanks work. Is tanks create threats like DPS, but they're louder about it. And they can do it for longer. And so what ends up happening is they create space more effectively and more consistently than DPS because of that psychology. You understand what I'm saying? Now, the reason why this is important, is because that psychology is a double-edged sword. Do you understand? Because when's the last time that you guys have played Winston? How did that situation go? What did the enemy team do? What do they swap to? What do they do when you jumped in? Bastion, Reaper, Malga. And even if they don't counter swap you, everybody looks at you. Everybody looks at you. And that's great for your team, but it can feel not super rewarding for you, especially if you're not going into it with the right mindset. So the problem is, and what makes tanks effective in Overwatch 2 is the fact that they're big, loud, and generally shorter range. What makes tanks not super fun is their effectiveness. So chat, the irony here is that tanks are very powerful in Overwatch 2. The tank role, as the single tank, is probably the most powerful position in professional Overwatch and in your rank game, probably. But it doesn't feel like it, because your value is not through necessarily being the hot, flashy guy. It's about securing as much attention and as many resources and living to tell the tale. You understand? How many of you guys have heard that tank is super weak in Overwatch 2? Tank is super weak? No, it's not. It's, if anything, even more important and powerful than it was in Overwatch 1. It just doesn't feel like it. And so our problem is how much of that tank identity are we willing to not compromise, but tune down, make tanks less big, less up in front of your face, more flexible with how they can play around that attention, versus do we want to leave tank versus without destroying what makes tank unique, which is the ability to close distances and be able to stay in your face for long periods of time. You see, the thing is if you guys how many of you guys ever played an MMO? How many of you guys ever played an MMO before? All right. Or right? All right. So what does a tank do in an MMO? In a PvE environment? What does a tank do? Right. Meat shield, right? Just stand there. And how do they do that? They have taunts, shouts, different ways of forcing the enemies to shoot them, right? The robot enemies are too stupid to really understand who the real threat is. So you have taunts to force the enemies to attack you, right? That's how it works, right? You hold aggro. A lot of tanks in MMO, a lot of MMOs that I've played anyway, don't really do any damage at all. So they force, because they can force attention through abilities. Like they force you to shoot them. The problem in PvP though, is that there's no such thing as a taunt. You can't force people to shoot you. People are smart. They're gonna be like, So what you have to do is you actually have to have tanks that are actually lethal. Like you actually have to have tanks that actually do real significant damage because you can't force a real person to shoot you. So how do they do that? And again, that goes back to my point earlier, is they have to be threatening. Kokuja, thank you for the sub. They have to be threatening and they have to get close. You guys ready for this? This shouldn't be a hot take, but this might be food for thought. There should never, ever be a spam tank. Never. It should not happen. This should never, ever, in the future of Overwatch 2, there should never be a poke tank, a truly poke tank. Sigma, Orisa, Brawl, Pokey, mid-range hybrids, that's fine, but there should never be a poke tank. What's a spam tank? Great idea. Seriously, think about it. What is a poke tank? Sigma's not a poke tank. Sigma works in poke comps because he has slightly more range. But again, this is the limit of my range, guys. Compare that to the entire DPS cast. The entire DPS cast, besides Reaper, and every single one of these characters has more potential to do damage at range than Sigma. How do you make a poke tank? It would just be a DPS. So there should never be any attempt to make a poke tank because it's a oxymoron. You can't have a poke tank. You can have a tank that functions more in the mid-range, but you can't have a long-range tank. It's not possible. It's not possible. So what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, how much of our tanking experience do we want to be direct threat and the ability to counterplay things, and how much of it do we want to be smoke and mirrors, where you leverage the psychology of being big and in your face and learn to absorb? Now, we know that the Overwatch 2 developers have a tankiness and damage spectrum. All right, that's what they said to me in person, where they try to find the balance between the tankiness and damage spectrum. Generally higher damage tanks, generally not quite as tanky. And I think that's something that we can kind of keep in mind. What about May? So let's go through our notes here. Let's talk about 6v6 and 5v5. All right, let's talk about that really quickly, and so we can actually shelve that conversation, okay? Because the problem with tanking in Overwatch 2 is that it used to be that you had two people that pulled the attention, two space creators, so that not every cooldown, not every DPS and support could look at you. And so that took a little bit of mutual attention away from the other tank, right? You put all the attention on the Orisa, the Roadhog is going to punish you. So you look at the Roadhog a little bit, and then those cooldowns are split here, okay? The problem with Overwatch 2 is now that all of those cooldowns, even if is a little bit less CC in Overwatch 2, is now going on the one tank because it's psychologically attractive, okay? Here's the thing, though, that is not discussed near enough, is that curse comes with a blessing. This is how Overwatch 1 used to function. You had your main tank, you had your off tank controlling an off angle, and then you maybe had a DPS and a support, and this is kind of like how it looked here, right? The problem with this is if your team blue here, and your tank isn't controlling a space or whatever, and you're a support or a DPS looking to take proactivity, you got completely stuffed by the enemy off tank constantly. Off tanks in Overwatch 2 denied your ability to take space. They controlled a lane, and because they were a tank and you were a DPS, you couldn't poke it out. Now, because the tank pools were a little bit lower, you could poke them out and eventually win that lane, but it was difficult and it took time. The advantage of one tank is that these lanes are more clear because wherever the tank is, even if it's not on main, if they're there, this lane is now clear. There's more flexibility for both DPS and support players, and there's more responsibility to be able to take space. And that's why I like 5v5. But we do need to solve the fact that there are now two tanks worth of cooldowns going on one tank. You are not forced to frontline in 5v5. That is a complete myth. I've heard that from a lot of higher ranked players. Those high ranked players are idiots, and they do not understand the game of Overwatch. I'm being a little facetious here, but it's true. That is a complete myth. So you have to, as a tank, in solo, you have to choose what lane do you want to shut down? What angle, what space do you want to shut down? Do I want to control space on main? Do I want to control space on left? Where's my matchup? And so on. So what we have to do here is we have to go, okay, so now there's 2 tanks worth of cooldowns going into 1 tank, all right? How do we allow this tank to survive this attention without this person being an unstoppable wall of absolute murder? Because one of the criticisms that I've been hearing, and it's a fair criticism, is I've been pushing for more counterplay for the tank options. The problem is how do you give a tank counterplay options, mitigation options, without making it unstoppable? And I think that the answer has to be skill play. Like, you have to have skill play. The problem right now is that we have too many tanks that don't have any way of outplaying CC or crowd control. See, here's a hot take. I actually don't think a hero like Winston, I don't think his problem is crowd control. Why? Because he has the capability of outplaying it. It's a skill play. I don't think D.Va has a problem with crowd control either. There's skill play available. Zarya? Not really. Skill play. Right? Even Ryan to an extent. The problem with the characters like Winston are more things like Bastion and characters where there's more easy direct value available. And there's more problem for characters like Roadhog. They don't have any counterplay at all. Right? So if we give Doom a way to get rid of CC, would that be a good idea? Yes. So if we gave, okay, hear me out, guys. If we gave Doomfist the capability of outplaying crowd control with skill, not just flat out invulnerability. We're not talking Ram Block. We're not talking Malga Cardiac. We're not talking Orisa Fortify. We'll talk about that in a little bit, all right? But if you gave Doomfist the ability to counterplay crowd control so that he was able to pose a threat without being immediately punished, you would take the edge off of the bad tank experience. So what would you do? So you give Doomfist the ability to counterplay crowd control. What do you do then now? What do you do then? I think you either need to make him less lethal or you need to turn down his raw survivability. You understand? The problem with Overwatch 2 tanks right now is that a lot of their survivability comes through their health pool. And not enough survivability comes through their ability to counterplay CC and burst damage. You understand what I'm saying? Ryan is a great example. I mean, guys, this guy has, how much HP does he have? I'm in the practice range, but how much, does he have like 700 HP? Of how much armor? I mean, half his HP in armor? It's ridiculous. He has so much HP. But yeah, he could still die quickly. It's not an HP problem. He just doesn't have a consistent way of, and we'll talk about Ryan and my suggestions, but same thing with Doom. Like, do you think if we gave Doomfist the ability to outplay crowd control with skill, do you think that he could lose 25 HP? Do you think that he could lose some of the shields that he gets from using his abilities? Because he'd actually be able to allow to use his abilities. Do you think Ryan's bigness is psychologically causing him to get focused? Yes, I do. Like with Hog, if he could cleanse himself, but he won't have 50% damage mitigation. Yeah, so the reason why we're talking about this is that even though Tank does provide a lot of value right now, the problem is not the value, it's how the value feels. You guys have to, like, one thing that I've learned, the more I've coached and taught, is you have to consider psychology. Again, Tank is just as impactful, if certainly probably more impactful than it was in Overwatch 1. I don't care what anybody says. They don't understand. Tank is extremely impactful. Being a solo tank means that you have the capability of pulling everybody's attention onto you and living if you play it well. It's just not always very fun. So we have to, ironically, take a little bit away, potentially, of Tank's impact and shift it to other roles, but make Tank feel more fun. So with a character like Doomfist or Wrecking Ball or Roadhog, they need less raw survivability, indiscriminate survivability that is super helpful. Like, think about Roadhog. You can't kill a Roadhog if you don't have CC. You can't do it. You're playing Moira and Lucio and you can't kill him. You can't kill him. It doesn't happen, right? But all of a sudden you got a nade or a Discord, and they're dead. And then that's the problem, is those extremes where if you don't have crowd control, you feel the HP that Roadhog has. But if you do have crowd control, you don't even feel the HP if you're playing the Roadhog. And that's the extremes that we have to address. And Samito, I saw somebody linked me something where he said something like, oh, well, we don't want all tanks to be homogenous. I respect Samito a lot, but I find that to be a lazy argument. Samito's idea is that in 6v6, we could have more extreme designs, just like there are in the DPS cast, because the second tank that you pick would help cover those weaknesses. For example, if I'm picking Roadhog, I'm very vulnerable to CC. But if I play Roadhog with Orisa, I now have a tank that's going to capitalize off of a lot of the cooldowns that are being saved for the Roadhog. Right? You can have this dynamic hedged bet, essentially, where you can't all counterpick me as Winston because my diva will farm you. You get what I'm saying? And so Samito says that you're allowed to have more extreme designs when there's two of that design. The problem with that is it doesn't work in psychology. It might work at Samito's level. It definitely works in pro play. Although I think Jake makes a good argument that maybe some of those tank synergies leave no counterplay options available, like Winston Zarya. But the problem is that's not realistic. Let me give you guys an analogy. How many of you guys have done maybe some light work in investment? Nothing crazy, but are you guys familiar with investment? Are you guys familiar with diversification of your portfolio? You guys familiar with that term? What diversification is essentially where you invest your money in something, but if that goes poorly, you have like a balance so that overall you're riding the market going up in theory, but you're not leaving yourself vulnerable to chance. A non-diversified portfolio is a gamble. It's just a gamble is what it is. If something goes badly, you lose all your money. If something goes great, you win all your money. And 6v6 tanking was a non-diversified portfolio because you were reliant off of the enemy team or your team making that investment decision with you. You guys ever played Age of Empires 2? In Age of Empires 2, Elephant, you could pick characters like this. This thing. It was really strong. Elephant, right? But it was really counterable, right? It was really counterable. You'd have halberds and there were like monks and stuff countered it and so on. And it was a meat shield that forced people to counter it. This is Roadhog, okay? This is Roadhog, right? The problem is that if I'm playing the elephant, when you're playing Age of Empires 2, you're not playing the elephant. You're playing everybody. You're playing the entire cast. And so if they counter your elephant, it doesn't hurt your feelings to diversify your battlefield with some archers, let's say, to counter the halberdiers, or maybe some scouts to counter the monks, right? The problem is if you are the one playing the elephant, you're not happy about being the one that's taking the enemy team's attention. And going back to our diversification of our portfolio, you are trusting your teammates to hedge your bets for you. You understand? You're giving up your financial management of your portfolio and hoping that your teammates hedge their bets properly. You understand? Like if I go Winston, I need somebody to hedge my bet with a Diva or a Zarya, or heck, even a Sigma, right? But what happens if they don't do what you need them to do? And that's the problem. That's the problem. Now, you do benefit from having the attention split, but this is why 6v6 tanking was always a bit of a crapshoot. And the other problem is that saying that, extreme designs are more okay. What happens in Overwatch 2 when you have both Mauga and Roadhog as your tanks? You have two extreme designs. that are vulnerable to the same things? What happens if you have Zarya and Roadhog on Watchpoint Gibraltar? You have 2 tanks that are vulnerable to the same things. What happens if you have Reinhardt and Orisa on Dorado? What happens if you have Winston and Wrecking Ball on Circuit Royale? And the list goes on. Now, I am bringing up worst case scenario here. My point being is that 6v6 is not, again, a magic pill. The difference between having that with 1 tank is that in our optimal 5v5 world, with tanks that have been scaled to Overwatch 2, is that you have tank designs that have tools and the capability to bend and mold to what the map provides. And that you as a tank, you are responsible for your own performance. And don't give me the they're all homogenized. They're all homogenized. Sojourn is freaking fun to play. Her rail is probably too strong, and she's way better skilled than a lot of the other ones, but she's fun to play. Jungler Queen with her shout and her poke and her range is freaking fun to play. There are characters like Tracer who are flexible and fun to play. Genji, flexible, fun to play. Echo, flexible, fun to play, right? And that's the thing. I would say the DPS is a more difficult time as a result of 5 because they're forced to take more risky mechanical activities in order to control space. Yes, but that's because in 6v6 there was so much attention put on just shooting out the enemy tank from main or the off angle that you wanted to control. It was maybe more rewarding in terms of ticky, but you didn't actually have as much impact. You just shot. Now you actually have the capability to make real plays. And I don't even know that there's always consistently. I understand what you're saying, Caffeine. I 100% understand. But there aren't always even necessarily 3 lanes. So basically, my thought with 6v6, I don't want to get too sucked into 6v6 5v5 argument, is that 5v5 you have more freedom as a support and DPS player to play make. Tank 6v6 also had the problem of the incorrect tank synergy meant that you were trusting your teammates to hedge your bets appropriately. And then also having extreme tank designs. I just don't think extreme designs are healthy for the game, period. I don't think extreme designs are healthy for the game, period. I just don't. I've never been an extreme design fan. Extreme designs are hard to balance and they don't function as well. I think if you look through a lot of Overwatch 1's problematic characters, and this is where I think I really disagree with Samito, is that I think that there's a lot of emphasis on the extreme designs were okay because they split the attention, but extreme designs were really bad. Orisa, extreme design, not very healthy for the game, right? Roadhog, extreme design, not very healthy for the game. Reaper, not healthy. Bastion, not healthy. We could keep going down the list. Junkrat, not healthy. Symmetra, initial design, also not healthy. A lot of these short-range, limited mobility characters, really, really not great for the game. Moira, limited design, not healthy. Mercy, in Release Break, the anti-dive character, killed the game, right? Yeah. Okay, can we stop about the D.Va Soldier? There's no way that even in Overwatch 1, a D.Va wins stage anywhere near a Soldier gets destroyed. That's not even an argument. But I also don't. So regardless, so let's talk about fixing. So this is my final thing though. The reason why I'm so focused on 5v5 is because we're not going back. What we mean by extreme design here, okay. So extreme design is a character that does one thing and does one thing really, really, really well. Right? 1, 2, you guys know what I'm talking about. Release Brig, right? Mercy, Pocket, right? Widowmaker, Sniper, got it, right? You guys understand what I'm saying, right? So, yeah, the attack defense heroes, right? And they learned pretty darn quickly that having the whole extreme design character was fun because it was novel, but it did not age well the more and more and more the game was played. Right. And then if you counter that, then it's no good. And we need to move past this whole idea of like, oh, well, if they counter any Widowmaker, you just swap. That's just rough, man. What if you don't have the capability to swap? What if you have a one trick? We're in a game where people are just not always going to want to swap. And don't tell me that we have to have homogenized characters. Genji, Tracer, Sojourn, Echo, Ashe, I think, are all examples of characters that are not at all homogenous, but feel very different, very unique, and do have different strengths and weaknesses, but also have the capability of outplaying and working in different scenarios. Ashe can work versus Brawl and dive and spam. Is she the best? No, but she can work. In what way is Sojourn? Sojourn is one-dimensional. You guys have to understand, when we talk about one-dimensional, we're talking about like, what is the character's range strengths, right? Is she close or is she long? Right? And she's kind of somewhere in between. Same thing with Ashe. Same thing with Genji. Genji can hard flank. Genji can hold a soft angle. There's choices with how you can position and how you do things. Doesn't mean that the character is perfect in design at all, but the general play style. There's how you position specifically. Okay. So I don't agree with extremes in play style in that regard. More decisions to make, right? I think Venture's great. Venture has a lot of choices. They're obviously relatively short to medium range, but you have to make constant choices about which offing. Like Venture is a great example of a healthy short to mid-range character because of the amount of decisions that you have to do with how you position, with how you can have, how there's different ways to use your abilities. Like Venture gets screwed by crowd control, probably, but Venture also has ways of playing around the crowd control and baiting the crowd control. Hey, Tio Kais, I would drop that and ask Spilo. Right now, we're kind of on a topic, man. I'm sorry. Would I define Doomfist an extreme design? Doomfist, I would say no. I'd say Doomfist has aspects that are a little bit too one-dimensional. Like, for example, Power Block is really, really weak in certain situations and really strong in others. No worries, mate. No worries. But because he can function okay in brawl comps and spam comps and dive comps, he's okay. He's got enough mobility, short range potential, flanking potential. He can function. I think Widow is an extreme DPS as well. And I think, Pharah, for example, was an extreme DPS, but now she's less so. Iliari, yes, extreme. Iliari is one of my least favorite Overwatch 2 characters. Something better? You guys are harsh today. Caricatures? I mean, I feel like extreme describes it fairly well. Not polarizing. It's not emotional. It's not emotional. It's just, that's what they do. Niche. Yeah, niche is a good one. Specialized. Yeah. Okay. So the problem that I think a lot of people will have when we talk about like 5v5 is that they will say, we don't want to give tanks the ability to counterplay CC mitigation too much because we have things like this. And we have things like this. And we have things like this. But this is a little bit of an unintentional strawman. Because this is not counterplay in any sort of strategic sense. And no 5v5 does not force these things. Otherwise, characters like Junker Queen and Winston would not be able to function. Or Zarya would not be able to function. Now, you could argue in ranked, they're problematic here and there. Yeah, but they've had their moments, they're fine, and they do very well. So, the problem, niche is said niche. It's niche or niche. You could say it either way. Artifice, thank you for the sub. Yeah. The problem is that when you compare this counterplay to this counterplay and this counterplay with, this counterplay, it's leagues apart. There's vulnerability. And not only is there vulnerability, but you notice as well, with what can Ramattra do while he's blocking? Nothing. It's not fun. There's no risk versus reward. It's not enjoyable. It's boring. Whereas a character like Sigma, every single cooldown requires choice. You only have so much shield, and it goes on a cooldown. And you can use it for yourself. You can use it on an off angle. You can use it to cut off healing. Even your shift has counterplay. And it's on a relatively, I wouldn't say a long cooldown, but it's on like it can be used offensively to close the distance and to build HP for yourself. Even your accretion is something that you can use and can be very important to use to protect yourself, but you might be missing out on opportunities to use it offensively. The difference between Ram block and Rein shield is that Rein actually, like flashing shield is something that's actually worth doing. Flashing block is only about blocking damage. There's no actual nuance with how you use Ram block. You're low, you use your Ram block. Whereas Rein shield, you have to block a crucial cooldown, right? You can block a cooldown with Rein shield. Oh no, there's burst damage coming in. I can react to that, right? Oh, I'm getting a little bit low. I want to keep my armor up, right? And you can actually move while you're doing it. Ram can do it as well, but Chad, maybe I'm smoking, but I think Rein can move faster, maybe? If anything, that's my one complaint with Rein. I think he should be able to move faster with shielding. Gives vision as well, right? So you can protect your teammates. Yeah, so it's a good question. Yeah, this is too slow. This is too slow for playmaking. Way too slow for playmaking, and you can't even block any cooldowns with it. It's exclusively used when you're low. Would you say Orisa's spin is better than... Yeah, because Orisa's spin does damage. It does damage. And it speeds you up. It's not Orisa has a problems, but Javelin spin is not one of them. So my point is that like you need thoughtful mitigation. And Sigma is a great example of this. Jungle Queens bleed, right? Shout, speed, plus the fact that you have to hit your abilities to keep yourself alive is a very thoughtful and challenging. Zarya, you need your bubbles. They give you energy, but also you need them to take space. Very thoughtful. Diva has her issues, but even Matrix, you can't just Matrix anytime. You lose damage, right? Winston Bubble, great example. You need Winston Bubble to do damage, but you got to be very careful with how and when you place it. I think we need thoughtful mitigation. We need thoughtful mitigation. This is just, what is this? Like, what is this? Like, what is this, guys? What is this? Even Orisa's Fortify, where it has like the cooldown mechanic, right? It's never actually relevant, almost never relevant, right? What is this? What is this?
I will have Olympus at any cost.
And see, what happens is then there's this impression that like, oh, all Overwatch 2 tanks have to have this sort of mitigation, but that's not true. These are just the tanks these are some of the tanks that we have. What is it specifically thought about Malgus Cardiac? What does Malgus Cardiac Arrest do? Or Cardiac Overdrive? What does Malgus Cardiac Overdrive do? Let's look it up. Cardiac Overdrive. Healing. It heals you. Also reduces damage. In what circumstance would you guys use Cardiac Overdrive outside of keeping yourself alive? Does this block cooldowns? Does this block? Is this gonna be a? No, absolutely nothing. You use it when you're low, and that's it. Even the secondary benefit is the same thing. You heal yourself more. It's the same thing, but more. And giving it to allies. The only nuance is potentially maybe wanting to use it with your teammates, but again, it's the same thing. There's no right. Jungle Queen Shout could be used aggressively or defensively. In fact, it's often used aggressively. And the other part of her tankiness is her sustain, right? Roadhog, Vape. What does it do? It heal and damage reduct. Can you use this for the damage reduction? Yes, that's one of the nice nuanced things, but you can't even counterplay it anymore. So I don't think shields are a bad thing anymore. It depends on how the shield is used. Honestly, guys, I would rather Orisa to have a shield than Orisa to have Fortify. I think it would kill the character, probably, and I don't want a poke character. But Orisa Shield was more thoughtful mitigation than Fortify. But here's the other hot take. You ready for the hot take? I don't think we need Orisa to have shield again. I think if you made Fortify buff up Orisa's damage, or buff, or we remember the whole Orisa rework where we put all this time into like changing how our weapon worked around Fortify, so there was like actually reasons to use it for offensive purposes. If you did that, we wouldn't need to have this conversation. We could keep Fortify. And you know what? Screw off with brainless mitigation. Let Orisa be headshot. Let Orisa be headshot. There's no way you're allowing somebody, you're punishing somebody for trying to headshot an Orisa. It's brainless mitigation. Brainless mitigation. If you made Orisa's Fortify actually give her some serious offensive benefit, and then you also let her be headshot, I'm just telling you guys, you'd have to make choices. You know what I'm saying? But right now, there's only one way to use Fortify, to keep yourself alive. Heck, that's why I like Javelin Spin, right? I think if anything, Javelin Spin could probably make you go, I mean, okay, you guys know what I think about Javelin Spin, right? You guys remember the custom game, the vertical Javelin? Oh my gosh, that was so much fun when we played it. But like Javelin Spin is really close to being like a pretty good damage mitigation thing because it does protect you, it eats the projectiles, it allows you to move faster, but you could use it to close distances and dive stuff, right? Terra would be trash without headshot protection, unfortunately. That is true. So maybe we make it that she's invulnerable during Terra Surge or whatever, right? There's innumerable things. But the problem with 5v5 tank is not that we don't want to give free goodies to tank, right? You don't want to do that. We don't want to just necessarily buff the tank passive indiscriminately. In fact, I think we got to be very careful how and where we want to buff the tank passive. Oh man. Here's a hot take, okay? Here's a hot take. Maybe we don't buff the tank passive until we make tanks less attractive to shoot. Or maybe, you know what I'm saying? There's psychology here, guys. This stuff takes work. This is why I get so mad at the whole 6v6 thing, because it's like, oh, it's a 6v6, everything's solved. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. It's not even close to being solved. This was just as much a problem in Overwatch 1. Just as much a problem. Maybe not for specifically tanks, but overall, we're wasting time. We need to be thinking about solutions here, real solutions. Tanks should have a smaller headshot critical multiplier. I've always fought that idea because I don't like having the idea of what am I trying to say here? Of punishing skill, right? Here's the thing. What if we reduced tank hitboxes by a little bit? By a little bit. And then you introduced, maybe you didn't even touch the tank passive. Maybe you didn't touch the tank passive. Maybe the DPS passive, maybe is what you reduced that with tank. But maybe you didn't reduce the efficacy of Sleep Dart and Nade and Discord. Maybe you did, maybe by a little bit. But maybe, okay, let's just for the sake of argument, you didn't. But you made the size a little bit smaller, and you gave tanks the ability to counterplay, crowd control. Maybe not indiscriminate. Again, one, right? Like you could have a parry mechanic with Doomfist, right?
Our future will be forged in conflict.
If tanks were less threatening, no one would want to shoot them. But that's the point, is if we by giving, love you, be safe, by giving tanks counterplay to CC, whether it's some or some form of like damage mitigation that's thoughtful, you are making them more threatening. You are making them more threatening. That's exactly what you're doing. So we have to balance that, right? By making them slightly slipperier, right? And so what we do is we make, let's just go for example. Let's say that there's some way that we can make Malga. Let's do Ramatra. We gave Ramatra, let's do Malga. This is just magical world here. We gave Malga, we gave Malga the ability to counterplay CC a little bit. And then we nerfed his hitbox a tiny bit. He would be really strong, right? Because he'd get basically 2 buffs. And he'd be just as scary as he was before because he would be harder to shoot slightly, but more lethal slightly. Then I think the next change you would need to make is probably nerf, like we talked about, nerf the raw HP. So we want to buff indirect survivability. We want to nerf direct raw survivability. And then adjust hitboxes as normal. And I think that's something that you would want to go down the list of tanks. If you're CC'd, you're getting hit anyway. Right, but that's why we introduce some form of CC counterplay. Because this is something I realized in a couple of weeks ago. I realized that like hitboxes actually do have a very important impact on the attractiveness of which targets to shoot. It's not an accident that the fatter tanks are the ones that everybody shoots. That's just how it goes. Yeah, I'm not talking about like, we're not talking about Malga specifically here. I'm just using him as an example. Some of these tanks, it's not like, oh, this would fix the tank. Some of these tanks have systemic problems. Roadhog, Malga, coming to Ramatra, Orisa, some of those guys. But I'm thinking like the globally, like we're thinking big picture here, holistically, okay? So what's happened from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2 is we increase the raw survivability, but we haven't really increased the functional survivability. And that's very important to do because now we do have one fewer tank. And so there are going to be more things thrown their way. I don't think the role of the tank is fundamentally flawed. I just think it's tricky to balance. And this is not a 5v5 problem. This is something that's even a problem. Like, here's the funny thing, chat. This is even a problem. How many of you guys have played PvP in MMOs? All right? How many of you guys played PvP in MMOs? How many of you guys have played a tank or played versus a tank in PvP in MMOs? It's usually a big problem, right? Because you have to be like, either I do no damage or survivability. Now, I think it's a lot more doable in the first-person shooter genre, though, because you can control the environment with which you're playing. I don't think it's fundamentally flawed. I just think it's trickier to balance. Remember, what is a tank? A tank is somebody that is generally more psychologically imposing and can hold your attention longer than a DPS. That's what we need to lean into. We need to ask ourselves, what makes a tank psychologically imposing and what allows them to hold my attention for longer? And we need to lean into that. And that's why we talk about CC counterplay. But there can be a limit. There can be an extreme. We don't need tanks to be the size of Malga to hold your aggression. A Junker Queen is significantly more imposing than, say, a Tracer. But she's relatively slender compared to other tanks. What do you think about the current high elo counter swap tank meta and how do you fix it? Well, the problem with the high elo tank counter swap meta is, I think to an extent, there's like two ways of looking at it. One is that these players are like at their level, even a slight advantage matters a lot, right? A slight advantage. So even if the tank counter swap isn't that big of a deal, if it matters enough, they will make the swap. The other thing as well is because these players have not solved how to adjust their compositional playstyle. And what you'll end up seeing is like the tank rock, paper, scissors is always exaggerated early in the meta because it's free value. As players get better at understanding the meta and what they do, generally the counter swapping tends to slow down just a little bit. I mean, I have a good example just the other day. I watched a couple of our overwashed matches, and we got sucked into the tank rock, paper, scissors a little bit. And it did not solve our problems. It felt better, but it did not solve our problems. And in many ways, we did worse. We also, before that, were playing a team who I'm pretty sure was stream sniping what tank we were playing and kept trying to counter swap our tank, and then they lost. They did not know how to play the tank into the composition that we were playing. I agree, Caffeine. I agree. You will not find me disagreeing with that statement at all. I think the counter swapping is more of a problem because it's easier to counter swap. It's just the nature of, it's not even in the nature of the tank, although he is the loudest or she is the loudest, biggest in person on the field. It's the fact that there's just one fewer people. If Overwatch 2 lost a DPS instead of a tank, counter swapping would have been more in the 5v5 environment. You know what I'm saying? It's just the nature of cutting down the number of players. That's how it goes. I don't disagree. I think what we have to do is, I think right now we have tanks that are a little bit too, they're too brawny, for lack of a better term. They are extremely in your face and extremely unequipped for dealing with that level of attention if the situation isn't right. Makes the game less accessible and enjoyable for lower elo players. Maybe. In that aspect, yes, maybe. You'd have to understand why is tank counter swapping a problem? Like when I go Winston. So, but we also have to keep in mind that a lot of these issues are not necessarily happening in a vacuum either, right? So when I go Winston, what do I worry about when I go Winston? Or Reinhardt? What do I get counterpicked with? Bastion. Do we have a Winston problem? Do we have a Bastion problem? What about Reaper and Roadhog? You know, I'm just food for thought. You know what I'm saying? Like, let me put it this way. If the enemy team went Orisa, Roadhog, Bastion in Overwatch 1, it was going to feel just as bad, maybe even worse. But he doesn't force the pick. So the problem is, guys, the problem is psychology. The problem is not strategy. The problem is psychology. The problem's not strategy. Let me repeat that one more time. The problem is psychology. The problem is not strategy. 99% of the time. Now, initially after the Bastion rework, Bastion was way too strong. But even now, you can play Winston and to a great deal number of counters, especially if the map is good. The problem is that people don't understand that, and the problem is that the people don't feel like they're getting the value. Chat, a great example of this one is that we know that Reinhardt does very well in lower ranks. Why? Because he's not super hard to play to get the initial value. But if you thought about everything, you believed everything that you read, you'd think that Ryan was garbage in low to mid ranks. Why? Because it doesn't feel like you're always doing stuff, even though you are really good at absorbing attention. And that's the problem. You guys have to remember this. I'm talking to you. You hear me? I'm talking to you. You think I'm talking to something? No, I'm talking to you. You do not have an accurate feel of how effective you are in your rank game. You don't know how good you are. And the reason I know this is not just because, psychology, whatever, because I've coached thousands of players in the last 2 years. Just in the last 2 years. Easily more than, I've coached almost 9,000 hours one-on-one. But I have coached so many in the last, since I've started, and every single time I will see, I will coach somebody who's counter swapping or being counter swapped. And I go, you just don't know what you're doing. You don't understand. Or you're swapping because you feel bad and they go on to lose. Chat, if I had a dime for every tank review that I have done where somebody swaps into Orisa and then loses the game. If I had a dime for every tank review I did of a Winston or a Diva or a Wrecking Ball, oh yeah, this is where I swapped Orisa and we lost the game anyway. It's a psychology problem. It feels like Orisa, like, hey, I'm not dying. I'm shooting tickies. Something's happening. And they lose the game. You lose the game. This isn't just, it's a skill issue. It's not even that. You could literally be bad at Winston and probably win more games than Orisa. But people don't want to do that. They would rather lose and feel like they're doing something than win and feel like they're not. And that is a psychology problem. That is not a fun, it is a psychology problem of something doesn't feel good. And why? You know? It's the swap to Moira. You know, you guys I remember that was so common back in the day. It's still kind of common nowadays where people will go like, oh, they will go Tracer. I go off of Zenyatta and I go Moira and they lose the game. You know what I'm saying? So what we have to find out is what feels so bad as Winston. What feels so good as Orisa? Maybe two, but this is the thing though. It's not just what feels so good as Orisa. What feels good as Orisa, but actually accomplishes nothing. You guys see what I'm saying? It's not just what feels good as Orisa. Let's make that happen with Winston. No. Because Orisa's doing nothing. Orisa thinks she's doing something, but she's doing nothing. Why is that? Why is that? Shooting the enemy tank, right? What is tanking, guys? We can conjecture here. We can think, Orisa has a lot of trash damage, but she's not very good she doesn't have the mobility to secure kills, or she has invulnerability, but she can absorb a lot of HP. She doesn't have a really fight impacting ultimate. She doesn't have the capability of going for squishies. You survive, but you don't put out enough pressure on enemy squishies. You don't create enough space. And so yeah. Now, whether Orisa's strong or not, I think Orisa's probably fine right now. In certain situations, right? The problem is that Orisa always feels more effective than she actually is. Always feels more effective than she actually is. And Winston always feels less effective than he actually is, and Reinhardt and so on. And it's not just a skill issue. So this is where we have to also get into the nuts and bolts of the game. And this is something that had to, again, I want to clarify, this is something that would have needed to have happened in 6v6 as well. You have to get into the nuts and bolts of the game and find out what do we need to do to make tanks still effective at controlling HP and abusing their psychology, but not such so that when I go Winston or when I go Roadhog, the entire team is looking at me the entire game. You get what I'm saying? Why is that the case? Because you can't just buff Winston. You can't just flat out buff. The guy's already strong. He's really effective at what he does. And if the map is halfway decent, he's actually one of the best tanks in the game, especially if you're halfway decent at him. He's really good. He doesn't always feel that way, but he's really, really freaking good. So this is where I've had some ideas here. I think hitboxes is something we need to consider. Audio cues is something that we need to consider. I think shifting more counterplay options to tank yet reducing their overall health pool so they don't just live if the enemy team doesn't have counters. Nerfing or adjusting characters that get value just by shooting tank. That's the other thing as well, is we don't want Bastion to feel as good as he does right now shooting tank. You get what I'm saying? It feels too good shooting Bastion into a tank. And again, this is for the Bastion's benefit as well. Bastion is good at tank busting, but I've reviewed several mid to low rank Bastions in the past 6 months. And those players exclusively shoot tank, without exception, shoot tank too much. They lose games because they shoot tank too much. Why? Because it's easy and it feels good. And so that's a Bastion problem. You see, this isn't just about tank. This isn't just about tank. It just so happens that a lot of the sillier, easier characters can dump their value on a tank and feel like they're doing something in the losing games. We just coached a Reaper today, right? So same thing with Torbjorn, right? And this happens with Ana as well. If I had a dime for every time an Ana just dumped a sleep dart or a nade into a Roadhog across the map, and the Roadhog freaking wants to quit the game, and then the Ana dies to the Tracer, and I'm like, right? If I had a dime for every time that happened, right? Or Zenyatta just dumps damage into the enemy tank and ignores the Sombra on the flank, and they lose the fight, right? That happens all the time. But the Zenyatta feels bad about that, nerf Tracer, FYI, right? And then the tank feels bad about that, even though they won the fight. Do tank busters need to exist in 5v5? Bro, I don't think tank busters need to exist in 6v6. I don't think tank busters need to exist in 6v6. I see no reason. In 6v6, the health pools for tanks were even lower. There was even less of a need to have tank busters in 6v6. There was no reason for Hanzo or Reaper or Bastion in the state that they were to exist in 6v6. There was zero reason. You didn't need that much damage to kill a tank in 6v6. They had lower health pools. So, like, my whole point is that, like, this is exactly what I'm talking about, though, right? Like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We have there doesn't need to be a tank buster character. It doesn't need to exist. Because this is why you don't need a tank buster character. The psychology of a character that gets in your face is already good enough to motivate you to shoot him. You don't need more motivation to shoot a tank than you already do. And the problem is that with the exception of things like boops, what's the problem with the ult charge, getting reduced ult charge from shooting tank? Think about it. What's the problem about getting reduced ult charge as a tank? And it's not that's a bad idea, but why isn't it an incomplete idea? Think about it. Think about it. Why is getting reduced ult charge, what we have currently in the game, why is it not good? Right. You don't feel the change. You don't miss more shots. I coached Lucio players back before they buffed boop, and you could see Lucio players really not going out of their way to boop tanks because they'd learned. They didn't even realize it, but they'd learned that it doesn't do all that much, right? But nobody shoots and then looks down at their ult charge. Oh, wait, I'm getting 20 or what is it, 15 or 30% less ult charge. Wait a second, I'm going to stop shooting tank. You don't feel it, right? You're not missing more shots. You're not noticing that, oh, wow, we lost this fight at 85% ult charge. If I had shot a squishy instead, I would have built my ult. You don't notice those things. So it's like it's a nerf to shooting tank, but the tank doesn't feel it, and you don't feel it, and so it doesn't change anything. It changes the results. So here's the funny thing. This is why lower rank shoot tanks more, because if you don't shoot tank and you duel people with your sleep dart and your nade, and you're going to win games. You're going to rank up. But the low rank players are going to stay stuck in low rank, not knowing, why am I not getting out of low rank? Because you're picking Orisa, you're picking Malga, because you're sitting on main and dumping damage into the enemy tank. And they don't know what's wrong because it doesn't, like, remember, the goal is that we have, this is why the tank discussion is so important, because this isn't just about tank. This is about Overwatch. Doing the right thing should feel good. Doing the wrong thing should feel bad. And I don't think that's enough of the case right now. We have to ask ourselves, what about the psychology of Overwatch can we help control, adjust, improve to make bad things feel bad and good things feel good? And right now, putting attention on the enemy tank feels way too good. Way too good for not being a valid and consistent way of attaining victory. Isn't recognizing this so you don't get value from it more of a skill issue than a faulty game design choice? No, I disagree. It's a good question. Like, if you're smart, if you watch Spilo videos, or other videos, you will learn. And but the thing is the reason why it's dangerous is we don't want the game to be unintuitive. A lot of people make fun of me, not make fun of me, but like don't like my rework ideas of like adding some nuance and complexity because they think, oh, Spilo just wants to make the game hard and every character to be super complicated. That's not true. But the irony is that like a lot of my changes are about trying to make the game more intuitive, where doing the right thing is easy. It's natural, right? Yeah, of course shooting the tank is valuable. Like you guys understand what I'm saying. Like there's obviously nuance there. It's situational, it depends. It's less valuable than you think it is. We want player perception and reality to be as close to 100% accurate. It will never be 100% accurate, right? I mean, look at like the ELO system that we have right now, where everyone's like still gaslighting each other about like the current rank system. But like, certainly we could do a better job, right? Certainly. Tanks are more effective when DPS supports. See, that's the funny thing is you're not even necessarily right, Jump Boy. If you want to be an effective tank, make people look at you. Even if you don't even do a lot of damage. If you look at them and you threaten them, actually making tanks harder to shoot would not make tanks more effective. It would make them less effective. They would be ignored slightly more often, right? And now you might have more freedom to make more plays, but it's a double-edged sword. Interesting, Kiba. I'll try it. So solutions here. We need more dynamics. We need more abilities with more dynamics. We don't want brain dead mitigation. It needs to be smart. It needs to be dynamic, where you can use it offensively, you can use it defensively. We do not want to give free mitigation through the tank passive. It needs to be brainful mitigation. Brainful, where the player has to utilize strategy or timing to be able to utilize things, or their mobility to utilize things well. I think you could argue adding some sort of tank passive value through like the DPS passive strictly because of how easy it is to apply. The question we have is, will tank always be the most valuable piece on the chessboard for his or her attention? Will tank always be like the most valuable thing to worry about? And I think that the answer might have to, and maybe this goes with what Chris was saying earlier, like where tank is a fundamentally flawed thing. Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe it will always be the most valuable, most important thing. Maybe there is no changing that. But certainly we can leverage that extreme and allow tanks to not be focused as much and have more agency in what they do. And I think that starts with counterplay with the tank. I think that starts with things like hitbox manipulation. And I think that starts with reducing the raw survivability of the tank. Tanks can be the DPS heroes with bigger hitboxes and more mitigation options. Remember, what is a tank? A tank is a damaging hero that can draw your attention up close to abuse the psychology of proximity and keep it there for a longer period of time. I want to look at my tweet really fast here. Flat said something a while ago, and I want to actually go through and fact check myself. Tweak the tank passive to account for things. Oh, wait, no. Increase the skill floor of brain to DPS heroes like Bastion Reaper. Yes, I think this is true. I know Flats said something about like, frick, what did he say? So something like, oh, well, we don't want entry-level characters to be too hard. There's no such thing as an entry-level character that's too hard. In terms of, people play Genji from the first thing. They don't need to understand every nuance of Genji. They don't need to understand what makes Winston powerful, the esoteric aspects of space. Simple characters can have high skill floors. On paper, Bastion is in many ways harder than a character like a Winston or something, just because there's cooldowns to manage and you die quickly there's just no reason for these guys to have as much value as they do. This is the Flats thing. Tweak the tank passives to account for things like anti-nade discord, DPS passive. I am not so sure on these. I'm not so sure. I would probably start with number 3 first and then incorporate number 2. I'm not sure how I feel about this. I don't think it would be harmful to have things like anti-nade last a little shorter or discord be a little bit weaker, but you would have to probably nerf tank HP a little bit as a result, as well as incorporating these things. I think these things cannot happen in a vacuum. They can't happen in a vacuum. This can happen in a vacuum, that's fine. These things cannot happen in a vacuum. It has to happen at the same time. Adjust tanks like a Roadhog Malgar risks that are overreliant on self-sustain for survival and continuing. Right, so like, there's too many tanks that only have one dimension of survivability, are way too strong on it, and are super vulnerable to others. Remove the extreme mitigation. Don't remove the nuance and interesting aspects of tank survivability, but definitely consider when the tank survive, or not tank survival, but tank playstyle, but do consider when the tank only has one method of survival and does only one thing. And then Reinhardt, like quality of life stuff. Where Ryan has too many things that are uncomfortable with Reinhardt, like the fire strike each damage, the earth shatter damage. I think things like him moving faster while shielding would give him more choice of engagement and disengagement, and manage his burst damage better. You can't universally buff tank. Finally, bonus is to consider the dopamine response of shooting tank hitboxes considering better mitigation that is less satisfying. Because this is the other thing about tank mitigation, guys. We'll finish our conversation with this. The reason why I'm such a big proponent of thoughtful tank mitigation is because this is not satisfying to shoot. You get what I'm saying? This is not satisfying to shoot. This is not satisfying to shoot. This is not super satisfying to shoot, although it does make a pretty juicy noise. This is not super satisfying to shoot. You get what I'm saying? This is not super satisfying to shoot, right? Brainful, right? So what you have, though, is when Hog is doing this, admit it, you guys keep shooting. Admit it. Heck, even this. Admit it, right? And also admit this. When this character is across the map, would you rather shoot this character? Or would you rather shoot this character? Admit it. Also, admit this. When this guy presses cardiac, you keep shooting, don't you? You do, don't you? Even though he's basically invulnerable from death beyond anti-nade, you keep shooting, don't you? Why? Because it feels good. It's not useful. It's not impactful, but just keep doing. Whereas a lot of the other mitigation that we demonstrated, it doesn't feel that good. When versus javelin spinning, you're not doing anything, right? When Sigma's shifting or shielding, right? And with Junker Queen's hitbox, it's kind of hard, right? And even indirect mitigation, right? No, I don't agree raid boss tank. I think raid boss tank is the opposite direction that we need to go because there's no way to make it balanced. Wary that if they make it more individually complex, they'll scare away new players, increase queue time. Seems like a battle on both fronts. Right, which is why you have to make sure that we adjust the noob-stomping, tank-busting characters. Nothing will make a player swap off of playing Winston or Reinhardt than a character like Malga or Bastion. Reflect, absorb, I'm not sure. Maybe a shield, maybe a barrier. This is also where I think hitbox adjustments are really important too. Having a tank that's slightly harder to shoot. I've noticed even in all my sessions that people generally don't shoot Doomfist as much as you'd think, right? Now, Doomfist does get focused a lot, but imagine if Doomfist was even 5% bigger. Oh my days, it would be awful as a Doomfist player, right? Because he's already attracted to shoot as it is. So it's just little hitbox tweaks like that. What if you increase support or DPS hitboxes? I mean, they kind of already did that, you know, to an extent with the projectile changes. I'm curious to see if long-term, if that projectile change ends up, because obviously that did affect tanks, but it was proportionally, and on paper, a bigger increase in terms of how easy it was to hit squishies. How do you fix the issues of tanks making space that their team won't take advantage of? You need to play a different game. PvP game will never solve that problem. Because the hilarious part about that is that it is a tank problem and a DPS support problem. For every person that I've ever worked with that has made that claim, we get into the replay code, and you know what we discover? That their teammates are morons, and that they're a moron too, that they're going in when their team's in spawn. That's just the nature of the game. There's some things there's some psychology you can't fix. The ELO system, outside of a few bugs and tweaks here and things like the volatile not being very communicated well, is fine. But people are going to continue to complain, and I don't really care. I've learned that I'm not going to let it bother me because people are just dumb, and that's just how it is. And people not following up off of your pressure, it's just not going to change. It is what it is. Yeah, sometimes you just have people that don't do what you want them to do, and that's just how it is. There's just nothing that's not the tank experience, right? Because I see this like tanks all like pity partying each other, like Alcoholics Anonymous, but like for supports, you know what I'm saying? Where it's like, oh, that's not really Alcoholics Anonymous, never mind. But whatever, you guys know what I'm saying? Like where it's like this big pity party, like, oh, as tank, you're just at the mercy of your DPS and supports. And that is like the biggest load of garbage I've ever heard in my life. That is the biggest load of garbage. You can literally say that about any role, and it's true. And I would bet, in my opinion, tank has more responsibility and more not more carry potential necessarily, but more ability to have direct impact on the fight or indirect impact on the fight. It's a freaking team game. You're not at the mercy of your DPS or your supports more so than any other person is. What do you think about EDRA? We talked a little bit about it earlier. It's just like, of course, yes, it's a team game. You're going to have bad teammates. That's just how it goes. And a lot of times, like I said, the impression of bad teammates is also like usually false as well, where it's usually like way more dynamic than that. Sometimes it really is just a bad game, but I would say a good 80% of the time, bad teammates are just your impression. It's not even true. It's a team game, guys. Like you are always reliant. And saying that like tank is more gatekept by things is just not true. Geez, guys, I feel like we've gone on forever. So I feel like for me, I feel like after discussing this, I don't know. I think like we got to be really careful about just giving tanks free candy. I think we have to take a look at what does tank need to outplay the worst of the situations. Some tanks need reworks. Some tanks need counterplay options. And more than anything else, I think we need a psychological adjustment with how attractive it is to always shoot tank. That is your 5v5 adjustment. Everything else, I think, is just objectively needed to be done, even in 6v6. But I think in 5v5, it's definitely something that needs to be considered more. And I think that's something that the developer team kind of rushed around. Maybe they didn't fully understand the ramifications of what removing a tank is, but it meant that it took the already attractive aspect of shooting the big fat target and did it more. Guys, again, I want to point out, like, this is something that happens even in PvP games in MMO, right? Where people will run like a tank class and they'll pop like an invulnerability cooldown and run right in the middle of the enemy team. And everybody in the enemy team shoots them, at least for a brief period of time. And it's just psychology here that you're fighting versus, and you just have to, it's hard to break. It's hard to break. I don't think tank will ever be totally fixed unless they literally just made it a third DPS. But I think a lot of people would be unhappy with that. And I think that that's sometimes where you have to make compromise about what's perfectly balanced and what brings character and nuance to the game, And I think like, maybe there's not ever a world where like tank is going to be perfectly problemless. But I do think that that's something that like, that's kind of like, we kind of have to live with that, No, I'm not disappointed with the Wrecking Ball reworks. I want to see it tested. What he proposed is psychological adjustment. We talked about it. We talked about hitbox changes. We talked about maybe audio cues. We talked about more effective means of mitigation besides just raw healing or damage adjustments. Because a lot of the tanks that are much better and much more healthy for Overwatch 2, like Sigma, for example, are characters that are not as attractive to shoot when they are using their mitigation. For example, the shield, the shift, and so on. A smaller distribution. Yeah, I am honestly kind of an idiot when it comes to the ELO system specifically, like how it's calculated. So Anyway, any questions, guys, specifically to the discussion at hand? I feel like we've gone on for a long time. I guess we could kind of wrap it up here. I'd probably make this into a video. I feel like I could go on and on and on and on and on, but I feel like there's a lot of nuance, a lot of discussion here. But I do think like these are the kind of discussions, like, not even if you don't agree with my ideas, which is totally fine. Like, I don't expect everyone to agree with me, obviously. But these are the kind of conversations that we need to be having about tank. We need to stop talking about 6v6. Like, if you want to be the bug in the ear about like bringing in an open queue, or if bringing in experimental mode, or that's fine. I can tell you it's not going to happen. I'm going to tell you it's not going to happen because we still have the queue problem, and I think the developers overall have just completely checked out that whole idea, for better or worse. But these are the conversations we need to be having. Okay, 5v5 is worse than 6v6. You're a 6v6 stan. You watch a lot of Spilo videos. You've watched the Iron video. I watched like 2 minutes of the Jake versus Iron debate, and I literally had to turn it off. Iron was just unbearably obnoxious. But you know, people like Spilo, they make good arguments, right? Okay, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? We're in 5v5. Devs are idiots. GG's. Okay, they don't want to go back to 6v6 for better or worse, right? That's not my department. That's not my opinion. But that's fine. If that's where you are, what are you going to do? What aspects of 6v6 are you going to be able to bring in to balance the things out? I do think Spilo makes good arguments. I think Spilo is sometimes gets hung up, but I do think Spilo brings a lot of good takes on the thing. I think his whole 6v6 thing gets tiresome, but that's his baby. You know, I'm sure people get tired of my counterplay thing. Jake was annoying as well. All right, well, perfect. I'm glad I dodged it. Iron was just Iron honestly reminded me of like a 16-year-old kid, dude. That guy is way too old to be acting like that. That was obnoxious. There was like no, it was just actually painful to watch. He's like 22. If you want 6v6 to make a good game, that is, we're committed to that. We're to do more. Is it unhealthy to have a tank that is attracted to shoot like Hog? Seems like a plausible hero fantasy. Good question. I don't know. I mean, you could make that argument that like maybe like I do like being the damage sponge. Maybe I do like abusing the psychology of that. I mean, I can't tell you you're wrong. Like, maybe. Any other questions? That was a good one. I actually don't have an answer to that question. I really don't know. That would be something that you'd have to experiment with and like probably need to like study the psychology. I'd have to think about it more. With the little information we have, what are you expecting for the tank hero coming in season 14? I don't have any information about the tank hero coming in season 14. And that's not even NDA. I don't have any information. I have no information. Some things I have to kind of play dumb with because of NDA. And some things I'll tell you guys down the road, you know, like I always double check to make sure like, hey, but sometimes in the moment I have to kind of play dumb around some stuff, but there's some things I legitimately just don't know. How would you change a character like Reaper to being more glued to a tank, all the game less attractive? Reaper's a tough one. You know, shotgun characters in general are tough. I think shotguns and snipers are like the tricky guns. I think the biggest thing with Reaper, which I hope they're doing with the rework, is that I hope that they're giving him some more mobility, like some more verticality, so that he can choose targets more. And then if that's the case, I actually think that you could even slightly like nerf his damage and buff his spread. It's gonna that one's gonna be hard because it's gonna be hard to buff the psychology, but at the very least, like you give Reapers more options. There's always two things. You always got to be like, can we make the psychology of the character feel better? And then can we give them more options to do more things? Kusuli, I think, for the sub. But that is a good question. Like, how do you make a shotgun character not feel good to shoot? I think that probably is a little bit on Reaper's side and a little bit on the tank side as well. He brought his life steal down. That's not a bad idea, yeah. Because the life steal is obviously directly... And some stuff just takes time, too. Like, I bet that the season 9 changes, maybe it's the DPS passive being like a conflicting goal, but like the projectile changes, I objectively made shooting non-tank better because it was proportionally easier to hit shots and squishies now, hit headshots and things that matter, right? But you know, it might take some time before the perception of that is kind of kicked in, you know? Balling right now, bro. I'm actually murdering these bots right now. It's actually insane. If you nerf Reaper, no, it wouldn't be a nerf to Reaper. It would be, I think if anything, Reaper probably needs a little bit of a buff, but you just need to kind of like, I'm fairly confident that they're gonna, I think they're gonna do the right thing with this character. And this is not India. I'm honestly, it's just a hunch. Reaper being situational, I think, is exactly the problem. Like niche heroes, niche, whatever. When it comes to this takes like CC debuffs diminishing returns, it's not a bad idea. I don't know how you'd incorporate that into the game exactly, but it's not a bad idea. That would definitely be your it would just be it's not a bad idea. I just question how like intuitive that would feel. It'd feel awkward to be like, yo, Brig, why did you whip shot the monkey? I was gonna sleep him first, kind of a question, you know, like can you imagine like having that conversation? I feel like that might be kind of awkward. What would I change about Bastion? We did a DPS hero rework video. You can look it up on my YouTube. We talk a little bit about how like changing his turret and such. I think one idea that I didn't like is that I don't like the turret on a resource. That was an idea we had. I think it's a bad idea now that I think about it, because it'd be really easy to save your turret. But there's some discussions about like not having self damage from your grenade anymore, bringing back his ultimate, which like the big you know, like that kind of thing. Maybe giving the opportunity to headshot, kind of like what they did with the April Fool's patch, kind of, sort of. Yeah, I agree, Stefano. And I think they'd still be big heroes, you know, like we don't want to, you don't want to totally, like there's a nuance with everything. I think this is like, I keep, you know, I swear my entire life I'm fighting caricatures, whether it's, and this is not fair to Samito to lump him into this category, but it's like the 6v6 thing, the awkward thing, I feels like guys always be on the lookout for people that say there's no, like just say that's the only thing. That when you find nuance, you often find the truth. You know? Right. Like, oh, destroying nuance or not destroying nuance, but like it's okay to have full extremes, or what were we referring to? Like nerfing their hitbox sizes by a little bit. Like tanks can still feel like tanks. Like we don't have to destroy the tank role. Not every role has to be homogenized. That's not at all what we're saying here. You know? Every 5v5 argument you said is brain dead except for yours. I mean, maybe, I don't know. Like maybe it's the way they're presenting it. Like it's also brain dead to say that like 5v5 didn't bring in problems. Of course it brought in problems, right? I'm still a 5v5. I think I enjoy 5v5 more. I think 5v5 is probably more realistic for the game and more, but also like, it's stupid to say that 5v5 didn't bring in problems. Of course it brought in problems. You know? So. I don't even like apologist as a term. I kind of say it jokingly, but like this says that like my job is to defend 5v5. No, my job is not to defend 5v5. My job is to find out what's wrong with 5v5 and fix it. You know what I'm saying? Like not really, but like that's my goal, right? 5v5 has issues. What could we do to fix it? What could we do to make it feel better? 6v6 had issues. What could we have done to make that feel better? I'm sure there's stuff that we could have come up with 6v6 as well, right? It's unfair to blame a lot of the one-dimensional crappy hero designs on 6v6, right? When in reality it was just Overwatch 1. That's not 6v6. Yeah. No. I know it was meant as a joke. I was meant as a joke. But I think it's a good discussion point. I'm stealing your comment, you know. But in reality, like both sides can get really like lazy with your arguments, you know. So it's very easy to just be caricatured. The one thing that I think that like I know is talked about a lot, but I will say that like the Q times things definitely matters. Saying that's the only reason why 5v5 can't work or is the best is lazy. like definitely adding more content, making tank heroes more enjoyable to play, definitely would have helped with queue times a lot. But it is true, tank, as long as it anywhere resembles any sort of like the brawler, will always be the least popular role. And so the queue times will be a problem. I don't agree that that's a good argument in of itself, though. But I don't even know that queue times is necessarily a symptom. Okay, it is a symptom, but it's not a symptom that I think we can ever fully fix. In the same way that 5v5 tank, having a solo tank being the only one focused down, is not something that we can probably completely fix either. You just choose your poison. You want to focus more on addressing queue times and making tank really attractive in 6v6, or do you want to make some more time designing tanks with more counterplay options? You just pick your poison. Overwatch 2 picked their poison. We got to live it. Yeah. The problem with the whole like people like the thing is like if you're a 5v5er, here's my thought. If you're a 5v5er, you have to admit that having one tank fewer causes tank focus problems. It's psychologically true. Like you can't deny that. You have to admit that. You have to deny, and you have to find some way. Oh no, I'm getting shut down. Like you have to find a solution to that or something to alleviate that stress. If you were a 6v6er, you cannot say that queue times weren't a problem. They are absolutely a problem. Were they exacerbated by the content drawn? Of course. Is it something that could have been made by more interesting and more dynamic tank heroes? Of course. But you can't sit there and pretend that's not a problem. Like you have to, again, choose your poison and choose which one you're fixing. So, I don't know. What was the question there? Do you think tuning down the visual and audio dopamine of a tank would have adverse effects, or now it could create a problem where now with those changes, dive tanks will feel less certain and won't do the job it needs to do? Right, which is why, well, the thing is, it's like, it's a double-edged sword. Remember, we're not looking to tune down the effect. By tuning down the attractiveness of dive tanks, or the threat of dive tanks, the psychological threat of dive tanks, what you do is you tune down the indirect threat, but you tune up the direct threat. So as a Winston, you would do more damage, but you'd bait less attention, right? So it would feel better. Your impact would be about the same because part of your job is to bait resources, but you'd feel better. You kind of see what I'm saying? That's the goal. Like the goal is to have about the same level of impact, but more of the impact is direct and less of the impact is indirect. You know what I'm saying? How do you make tanks bait less attention? That's what we talked about. That's what we talked about. That's where we started to talk about hitboxes. That's where we talked about more satisfying means of damage mitigation. And that's where we talked about like the brain deadness of some of the tank counter heroes and the skill floor of tanks countering tanks. Like here's the thing is like if I'm playing Winston and there's no Bastion, there's no Reaper, there's no Malga, I'm limited by my own skill at that point to an extent, right? Like in terms of like the amount of damage that I can get, you know? It discourages people from shooting you by a little bit, but there's also availability for me to be able to outplay the thing. Like if I can look a silver gold player in the eye playing versus a Malga Bastion and say, it's a skill issue that you're not getting damage in, then I'm confident. And I don't always feel confident that I can say that right now. Kindervader, yeah, we talked a little bit about that. I won't rehash it, but we definitely talked about a lot of the newer tank mitigation abilities are very one-dimensional. Very one-dimensional. And I think that's why Sigma has felt so good in Overwatch 2 is the fact that all of his mitigations are dynamic. Like they can do any, you can even, like even the shift is not exclusively, you can use that to absorb HP while you're walking forward before you even need it. You can just use it to get some extra HP. If Blizzard offered you a job in hero design, would I take it? I don't know. I hope that my ideas are maybe not my exact ideas, because I think I'm relatively inexperienced coming up with good solutions, but I hope that at least the psychological aspect of things, because I do believe that I am correct with these kind of things. Maybe not my exact solutions, but my stance. I hope that I'm inspiring ideas. I don't know that I would take a job. And that's frankly more of a fragility in my end. I don't think I'd be able to. I think it would like the nature of the job is you just have to sustain criticism constantly, you know, and a lot of it's unfair, and that would be, you know, that would be tough. And I like what I'm doing too much right now. I like the fact that we can talk about these things, and I still deal with criticisms, of course, but I can actually interact with you guys. I don't know that the Blizzard developers have that luxury, and that is always awkward. A little interaction, right?